All right, so everybody, what's up? I wanted to make this video my inaugural Black and Intellectual video about the recent Department of Justice report that was released about the Baltimore Police Department and all of their highly unconstitutional endeavors and how they blatantly go around and violate the First Amendment, the Fourth Amendments, and then likely the Fifth and 14th Amendments as well. There's a complete and total violation of due process. There are clearly things that are going on in this country on a daily basis that people simply are just not being held accountable for. And we're not just talking about, going against policy. Like we're talking about the Constitution. So you have all of these right-wingers who love talking about the Constitution, who love talking about the First Amendment and the Second Amendment, really only when it applies to them. If we're talking about violating the constitutional rights of black people, all of a sudden people don't really care about that anymore. Which is why a lot of people are silent about this BPD report from the DOJ. Specifically, the Civil Rights Division of the DOJ. So I'm about to break this down for you guys. I'm going to show you, a capture of my screen. And we're going to go over this together. I'm not going to break down the whole entire thing. If you want to do that, you can easily find it online. I would advise you to read it in your spare time, simply to know what is going on in this country. And this report really legitimizes everything Black Lives Matter and black activists in general have been saying for well over a year now. And quite frankly, if anybody had said half the stuff in this report before this report came out, you would be labeled a conspiracy theorist. They'd be calling you a conspiracy theorist. They'd be calling you anti-cop and all this other stuff. So I'm glad the report came out. There are problems I have with it, but we're going to get to that. We're going to cross that bridge when we get there. So let's break this down now. Let's see what's really going on that shouldn't go on in this country, in a country that prides itself in being a democracy. I don't really know how democratic you can be when constitutional violations are occurring up under everybody's nose for years and really nothing is done about it. And still, after this report comes out, nothing may be done about it, except for some reforms, quote unquote, which is just really a get out of jail free card for these cops who have completely, for the lack of a better word, completely crapped on the Constitution. So let's begin. Okay, so this is basically the title page of the Justice Department BPD report. It says investigation of the Baltimore City Police Department Civil Rights Division, August the 10th. The report itself is broken down into three main sections. If you really, the whole thing here is 163 pages long. I suggest if you want a lot more detail, you can easily find this online and you can download it yourself and really just take a few hours and just really soak it in. I mean, there's so much here. I would have to do like a 2-3 hour video, just going over everything. And I just don't want to make a video that long. And so I'm gonna really kind of be selective about what I talk about here. But and most of the time, most of what I'm gonna talk about is in the executive summary. Like if you don't want to read the report, but you kind of want to get a good idea of what the report says in detail, read the executive summary. It's only like 12 pages, if I'm not mistaken, or a little under 12 pages. And it gives you the full rundown. And you can just go into more detail if you want. So here we have the executive summary. After engaging in a thorough investigation initiated at the request of Baltimore City and BPD, the Department of Justice concludes that there is reasonable cause to believe that BPD engages in a pattern or practice of conduct that violates the Constitution or federal law. BPD engages in a pattern or practice of making unconstitutional stop, searches, and arrests, using enforcement strategies that produce severe and unjustified disparities in the rates of stop, searches, and arrests of African Americans,
using excessive force, and 4, retaliating against people engaging in constitutionally protected expression. Okay, so all throughout this report, you're going to see the phrase constitutional violation get used, and constitutionally violated, and constitutional infringement and things like that. Like the constitutional abuses by the BPD are so rampant that they have to break them down into separate categories. That's how bad they are. So let's continue. I wrote something here. I left notes around the page to sort of, leave sort of what was going through my head at the time. And I said here they wanted to get this out of the way purely because they go through this whole thing here in the third paragraph where they talk about, yes, we know, cops have a tough job and everyday police officers risk their lives to uphold the law, to keep our community safe, yada, yada, yada. They have to get that out of the way first because honestly, they're about to go in. Okay, providing policing services in many parts of Baltimore is particularly challenging where officers regularly confront complex social problems rooted in poverty, racial segregation, and deficient educational, employment, and housing opportunities. Each of these systemic deficiencies contributes to the constitutional and statutory violations we observe. Basically, these are the problem with what's going on in Baltimore is that not only is there a police brutality and a police abuse problem, but that problem is exacerbated by the fact that Baltimore is one of the poorest cities in the country. And that poverty creates violence. That lack of upward mobility, which they talk about in this report as well, that creates problems. And people become desperate. And people become violent. And people start, going at each other because they really view themselves as having no future. So if you want to solve the problem of police brutality, you have to solve these underlying issues. But, I don't want to stick too much on that. I'm going to continue. I highlighted this here, constitutional policing. This needs to become a term that we use more often. Because what this report lays to bear is that a lot of the policing, and especially in communities of color, I know this report is specifically about Baltimore, but you can make the argument that what's happening here is happening in numerous cities around the country because there are reports and stories of similar things that they talk about in this report happening in other cities. So it's not just Baltimore. So the whole idea of constitutional policing needs to be reaffirmed. Okay, because what's going on now is not constitutional. Okay, so unconstitutional stop searches and arrests. This is a kicker. BPD's legacy of zero tolerance enforcement continues to drive its policing in certain Baltimore communities and leads to unconstitutional stop searches and arrests. Many BPD supervisors instruct officers to make frequent stops and arrests, even for minor offenses and with minimal or no suspicion, without sufficient consideration of whether this enforcement strategy promotes public safety and community trust or conforms to constitutional standards. These instructions, coupled with minimal supervision and accountability for misconduct, lead to constitutional violations. Now, let's read this here. BPD officers recorded over 300,000 pedestrian stops from 2010 to 2015, and the number of BPD stops during this period is likely far higher due to underreporting. These stops are concentrated in predominantly African-American neighborhoods and often lack reasonable suspicion. Check this out. The total population of Baltimore includes 622,104 people as of 2013. So even though they only have a little over 300,000 stops, it says that this is underreported and it's likely far higher. We could be talking about 500,000 stops. You could be talking about the same number of stops as the number of people who live in the city of Baltimore, which is crazy. This is harassment. This is literally state-sanctioned harassment of the community, of the population. They do not view these people as citizens. BPD's pedestrian stops are concentrated on a small portion of Baltimore residents. BPD made roughly 44% of its stops in two small, predominantly African-American districts that contain only 11% of the city's population. 44% of the stops came from 11% of the city's population. Consequently, hundreds of individuals, nearly all of them African American, were stopped on at least 10 separate occasions from 2010 to 2015. Indeed, 7 African American men were stopped more than 30 times during this time period. That is beyond insane. BPD stops often lack reasonable suspicion. We go back to this point that was made prior, because a lot of people, especially you get right-wingers who make these assumptions about people, especially when it comes to black people. They like to assume that black people are criminals, and that legitimizes their racism against our community. So they make these assumptions that well, you know, they must have been doing something wrong. No, this report shows no. Actually, it says right here, only 3.7% of pedestrian stop resulted in officers issuing a citation or making an arrest. 3.7. An incredibly small number. And as noted below, many of those arrested based upon pedestrian stops had their charges dismissed upon initial review by either supervisors at BPD Central Booking or local prosecutors. Okay, so let's go down to arrests here. Officers, well, I'll just read this. We identified 2 categories of common unconstitutional arrests by BPD. Look at that. Common unconstitutional arrests. Oh, those are 3 words that do not belong in the same sentence together. Common unconstitutional arrests. So many that they had to separate them into 2 separate categories. Come on, people. Number 1, officers make warrantless arrests without probable cause. 2, officers make arrests for misdemeanor offenses such as loitering and trespassing without providing the constitutionally required notice that the arrested person was engaged in unlawful activity. The word unconstitutional is dropped so many times in this report, it's not even funny. Discrimination against African Americans. So, BPD disproportionately stops African American pedestrians. Let me actually zoom in a little bit here. I don't know. It might be a little small on YouTube. I'm going to just zoom in. BPD disproportionately stops African American pedestrians. Citywide, BPD stopped African American residents 3 times as often as white residents after controlling for the population of the area in which the stops occurred. In each of BPD's 9 police districts, African Americans accounted for a greater share of BPD stops than the population living in the district. One African American man in his mid-50s was stopped 30 times in less than 4 years. Despite these repeated intrusions, none of the 30 stops resulted in a citation or a criminal charge. Look at that. This is almost identical to the Philando Castile situation. He was stopped numerous times. This is harassment. This is state-sanctioned harassment. I don't know what else to call it. There really is no other way of looking. When you're stopping people for bull, I'm trying not to curse too much. I'm just gonna drop a few F-bombs and BS bombs here and there. You can't help but to do that after reading this crap. And I'm not saying the report is crap, but what's going on is crap. Let me just continue. I digress on that. You just let that sink in. I'm not going to delve too deeply into that. Racial disparities in BPD's arrests are more pronounced for highly discretionary offenses. Racial disparities in BPD's arrests are more pronounced for highly discretionary offenses. African Americans, black people, accounted for 91% of the 1,800 people charged solely for quote-unquote failure to obey, which is a bullshit charge. That is a charge they throw out there just to lock people up because they don't like something you're saying. When half the time they don't have the constitutional right to do that. 89% of the 1,350 charges for making a false statement to an officer, and 84% of the 6,500 people arrested for disorderly conduct. Moreover, booking officials and prosecutors declined charges brought against African Americans at significantly higher rates than charges against people of other races, indicating that officers standards for making arrests differ based on the race of the people being arrested. So, if you're black, you have a much lower standard for getting arrested. They arrest black people easily. That's basically what this is saying. If you're white, there's a higher bar. They actually respect you if you're white. So they don't arrest you for a bunch of BS charges that have to get thrown out because the people, the booking, what do they say? The booking officials and the prosecutors know their BS charges, and they know that they lack evidence, and they know a lot of this stuff were violations of the Constitution. So they throw the charges out. BPD deployed a policing strategy that by its design led to differential enforcement in African American communities. Right down here, in some cases, BPD supervisors have ordered officers to specifically target African Americans for stops and arrests. Now, I have several things written here in notes, intentionally targeting blacks by the BPD. And then here, design differential enforcement collapses the idea that simply because the training isn't up to par, then the BPD isn't full of bad actors who unconstitutionally abuse their authority. Knowingly abusing power is a bad act. People get into this thing where they like to talk about the training, and they like to, I think, focus too much on the training. And don't get me wrong, the training is definitely piss poor. The DOJ goes into the training and you know how the training needs to get better. I'm not saying making the training better is a great preventative measure. Okay, making the schools better and giving the people of Baltimore more mobility, more chances to exceed in life. All of those things are great preventative measures, but it goes beyond that. Okay, because people are being intentionally targeted and their supervisors are telling them to target people. That's what this report lays out. They're being told to, there's nothing in a police manual that says target black people. When you start getting instances where people are being targeted intentionally and institutionally, that's not a training issue. It's not. That training is not fixing that. But I digress, and I'm just going to continue. So we're on page 9. Let's go to page 10. So this starts getting a little bit more into what happened with Freddie Gray. Nonetheless, we found evidence that BPD, number one, routinely fails to properly secure arrestees and transport vehicles. Number two, needs to continue to update its transport equipment. And number three, fails to keep necessary records. Number four, must implement more robust auditing and monitoring systems to ensure that its transport policies are training and transport policies and training are followed. And they say later on, I'm not sure if I'm going to go over it or not. I had it highlighted, but I don't want the video to go on too long. They talk about how they don't really have, based on their research, they don't really have too much constitutional evidence with regards particularly to rough rides. Okay, but they say that there are numerous instances where they know for a fact that people are not being secured properly. So basically, Freddie Gray did not break his own spine. They don't say that specifically, and they kind of they mention the case, but they don't really go too much into litigating that case because as they were writing this, the case was still ongoing. But yeah, if you believe Freddie Gray broke his own spine, you may believe in the Tooth Fairy and Santa Claus. That's how much validity that belief has. It has none. Let me continue. BPD violates the First Amendment by retaliating against individuals engaged in constitutionally protected activities. Officers frequently detain and arrest members of the public for engaging in speech the officers perceive to be critical or disrespectful, and BPD officers use force against members of the public who are engaging in protected speech. BPD has failed to provide officers with sufficient guidance and oversight regarding their interactions with individuals that implicate First Amendment protections, leading to the violations we observed. violations of the First Amendment, violations of the Fourth Amendment, the Fifth Amendment, the 14th Amendment. We just have violations all day long in Baltimore. So let me go to page 12. I have something here that I want to mention in particular. This kind of starts getting into some of the problems I have, not necessarily with the report. I know I said that earlier, but not necessarily with the report itself, but problems with how what's exposed in this report is going to be handled. What the exposures of the crimes in this report are going to be handled. To that end, the Department of Justice and the city have entered into an agreement in principle that identifies categories of reforms the parties must agree to take, or well, let me go back. Reforms the parties agree must be taken to remedy the violations of the Constitution and federal law described in this report. Both the Justice Department and the city seek input from all communities in Baltimore. Yada yada yada. Basically, this is the DOJ's get out of jail free card. The Constitution is not being upheld by police departments, and simply agreeing to implement reforms doesn't erase the fact that those violations still occurred. And see, that's the problem I have with this. And that's the problem. Now, this kind of is a problem with well, I don't want to say it's a total problem with the report, but it's a problem with how the report is being received. Okay, because the damage is still being done. The damage has been done. The knife is still in the collective backs of the people of Baltimore. That knife is not coming out simply because the city agrees to implement some reforms. I mean, are any of these people going to be held accountable? No, apparently not. So, I mean, it's just like the Ferguson report. Like they expose all of this crime, all of this corruption, all of this criminality, all of these violations of the Constitution. Nobody is held accountable. They slap them on the wrist. They say, okay, if you put in these reforms, we won't do anything else. And of course, the city is going to do that because they don't want to be taken to court. They don't want to go to jail. And so the DOJ gives them this back door to avoid accountability. I have a problem with that. Like, you're either going to uphold the Constitution or you're not. That's my opinion on that. Now, I'm going to skip ahead here. I'm going to skip a lot, actually, because the video is already going on a little too long. I'm looking for something in particular. This is a little bit more about the Freddie Gray situation. Let's see what I have here. 117. What's on 117? Okay, let's start here. I'm gonna talk about the violations of the First Amendment. Because you oftentimes hear a lot of these alt-right and a lot of these conservatives, and even you oftentimes get liberals who get on this stuff about getting mad at people who don't want to hear a lot of the bullshit from right-wingers and a bunch of these racists and these white supremacists. Okay, so they go into this whole faux outrage, and about, oh, well, you're violating my free speech, yada yada yada. Number one, citizens cannot violate your free speech. That's something that only the government can do. Okay, private institutions have the right to say that they don't want certain people and certain groups coming there, and I'm not going to go too much into that, but basically what this report is saying is that all of these people crying about First Amendment violations and supposed First Amendment violations from black activists and liberals and things like that pale in comparison. They pale in comparison to what goes on up under everybody's noses that the state is actually doing. Y'all can cry about, free speech on college campuses all you want. But if you want to see some real violations of the First Amendment, read this report and get back at me. It's funny when it comes to violating the Constitution and black people's constitutional rights, people get real silent. People kind of want to avoid that. When it comes to protecting the free speech of a bunch of racists and a bunch of neo-Nazis, you get 10, 20 fucking videos about it. And look, pardon my speech, but I'm gonna just read this to you. And this spells it out plain as day. The people of Baltimore have a constitutional right to observe and verbally criticize the police. That's the first sentence. And this is in quotations. Since the day the ink dried on the Bill of Rights, the right of an American citizen to criticize public officials and the policies is the central meaning of the First Amendment. They said that back in 2001. McCurdy versus Montgomery County. Since the day the ink dried on the Bill of Rights, Americans have the right to criticize public officials. Last time I checked, cops are public officials, y'all. We found that BPD officers routinely infringe upon the First Amendment rights of the people of Baltimore City, typically in one of three ways. Once again, violating the Constitution so many ways, they got to break it down into several categories. First, we found that BPD unlawfully stops and arrests individuals for speech they perceive to be disrespectful or insolent. Second, we found that police officers retaliate against individuals for protected speech through use of excessive force. Third, we have concerns that BPD improperly interferes with individuals who record police activity. Now, that last one is a big one. All over the country, this lays out, point blank period, okay, that the right to record police is protected by the Constitution. It is protected by the First Amendment. So every time you see or hear stories about cops taking somebody's phone after they recorded something the cops are doing, destroying the phone or deleting videos on the phone, that is unconstitutional. And actually, I believe that there are some certain states where it's actually illegal to record the police. I don't know how they get away with that. How do they get away with that? How do they get away with implementing blatantly unconstitutional laws and nobody's saying anything about it? Let me continue. The freedom of individuals verbally to oppose or challenge police action without thereby risking arrest is one of the principal characteristics by which we distinguish a free nation from a police state. That was established in the city of Houston versus Hill, 1987, same year I was born, actually. Meaning that if the opposite is happening, we live in a police state. If your freedom of speech is being infringed upon by police action, that is literally the definition of a police state. It doesn't get more cut and dry, straightforward than that. In another incident from 2011, BPD officers arrested a man for disorderly conduct after he refused to leave a public area following an order issued without just cause and yelled "F you" repeatedly at the officer. This arrest was also unlawful as individuals may not be punished for using vulgar or offensive language unless they are using fighting words. That is, words that by their very utterance inflict injury or tend to incite an immediate breach of the peace. Meaning that, you can't threaten cops, obviously. You can't threaten to kill people. That's not protected, by the First Amendment. Okay, you can't, death threats are not protected. And they shouldn't be. Okay, but you can't be retaliated against and you can't be attacked and arrested simply because you said F the police. And regardless of whether or not you like that statement or not, that is a constitutionally protected statement. Constitutional violations left and right in America. If I didn't know any better, I would say our Constitution is written with crayons on parchment made out of dried poop. Because apparently nobody is following the Constitution in this country when it comes to some of these amendments. No, you have violations left and right. What do we have a Constitution for? Why? What is it there for? Maybe it's just there to make us feel good. Maybe that's it. BPD officers also violate the Constitution by arresting individuals who question the lawfulness of their actions. You can't do that. That's a violation of the First Amendment. That's why you guys are now seeing why a lot of these cases never make it to court. You guys are now seeing why a lot of these cases don't go to trial. While a lot of these families are paid off, or either you get a Ferguson situation where you get some corrupt prosecutor who uses a corrupt grand jury scheme to avoid accountability. That's why a lot of these cases are not going to trial. Okay, they do not want something being on the books of cops violating the Constitution of the citizens. That is not something they want on the record. So what we have here is we have likely tens of thousands of cover-ups that have occurred in this country in various ways, various forms, one way or another. Thousands of cover-ups, okay, where violations of the Constitution were not acted on, and they were literally covered up. Like this is not remotely democratic, people. This is totalitarian. I'm sorry, I'm fumbling over my words now because I'm trying to stay calm as I'm reading state-sponsored BS, state-sponsored thuggery. BPD uses unreasonable force to retaliate against individuals who engage in protected speech critical of law enforcement in violation of both the First and Fourth Amendments. The law is settled that as a general matter, the First Amendment prohibits government officials from subjecting an individual to retaliatory actions for speaking out. Okay? Protesting is a form of speaking out. Protesting police action is a form of speaking out. So what happened in Ferguson? What happened in Baton Rouge? What happens in New York? What happens in Chicago? What happened in Baltimore? Are blatant violations of the First and Fourth Amendments. Blatant as hell. But we live in a representative democracy, so I'm told. You know, that's what I learned in U.S. history, at least. I don't really know how true that is anymore after reading this report. I have written here, many, if not most, acts of police brutality are blatant constitutional violations. And that's basically what this is saying here. So I'm honestly gonna end it on that. Like this is really disgusting. This is a travesty. This is a complete and total miscarriage of justice. It's hard for me to believe that equal justice actually exists in this country. After reading this report, I now believe fully that what happens to black people in the criminal injustice system is not by accident. Okay, if you believe that, then I don't really know what to tell you. You're believing what you want to believe, honestly, because what this report is saying is that the report isn't saying this. This is my interpretation of the report. I believe much of the police brutality that happens to the black community is intentional. I believe a lot of it is by design, and the report states, vaguely states as much. A lot of this stuff is not training. Some of it is training, especially when it comes to ignorance of the law, which clearly a lot of these cops are ignorant of the Constitution. So that is a training issue, but when it comes to them targeting people, when it comes to them targeting specific areas of a city, okay, that is not a training issue. That is something that is deliberately being done. And this has been going on for decades. You had people in the 60s protesting against police brutality. That's why some of them riots occurred in the 60s. A lot of them riots started because of police brutality. And the Black Panthers started because of police brutality. This has been going on for decades, people. How many tens of thousands, dare I say hundreds of thousands of people in this country have had their constitutional and human rights violated? We have got to start taking this seriously. And I'm gonna end the video here. I just advise everybody to read this study. I could go on for another 2 hours talking about this stuff. They talk about all sorts of sexual abuse violations against women. They talk about just so much stuff. It'll make your head spin. But I'm gonna end the video here because it's late, and I'm getting so upset that I don't really know if I'm gonna be able to sleep properly tonight. So check me out at blackandintellectual.com. Follow me on YouTube, follow me on Facebook, follow me on Instagram, follow me on Twitter, follow me on Pinterest. And I'm going to be in touch. Peace.